Hello, everyone. Welcome to Digital Workplace Day. We've been looking forward to this day for a long time, and it's great to finally be started off with everything. Today is the first of 3 digital workplace debates that we're starting. Very excited to get this one going off. You're seeing all the panelists here right now, and I will introduce you to all of them very soon. But first, a few things to cover before we get there. First is that we do have a contest going on. So if you check out any of our social platforms on LinkedIn or Twitter, we have a question that's there about how would you recommend one tip to level up your digital collaboration. It's kind of the topic for today's discussion. So if you get on there, post the comments. We're going to collect those comments. We're going to close those in about 30 minutes. So make sure you get on there and give a response to that. And we're going to give away some prizes at the end of this session as well. Next, as we get going, we are in a platform called AirMeet. I'm going to turn it over to Shweta, who's going to kind of guide you through some of the features of AirMeet.
Thank you, Neil. Hello, everyone. This is Shweta Kannan from the Digital Workplace, and I'll be helping you navigate through AirMeet. Thank you so much for joining us today. And just a few basic housekeeping things. So to keep in touch with your fellow participants, you can use the chat tab to the right side of your screen. There is also a poll option. Watch out for a red dot over the letter to know when there is a poll posted. The results of the poll will also be casted on screen. There is a question and answer Q&A tab where you can ask your questions to the panelists. And also here's a fun feature. You can also upvote a particular question which you think you want to be answered by a particular panelist. There is a raise hand option. Please do raise your hand and we'll help you out if you're having any trouble with the platform. Thank you, Neil. Over to you.
Great. And you can go ahead and start putting any questions into that Q&A tab. If you want, we will get to those towards the end of the session. Is great. But actually, I want to start off with our first poll. So the question that we're dealing with today is around this statement. Most teams will not reach the maturity required to do great digital collaboration. So Shweta, if you can go ahead and put that poll up. It's just a simple agree or disagree. When we're talking about collaboration at this point, we're talking about whether or not, mostly about communication revolving around projects that are going on, processes, ad hoc communication that goes through. So we're going to run that poll and just to see where the audience is. As we do that, I want to introduce our panelists. And to do that, we are also going to do a check-in question just to make sure everyone is feeling good about what's going on. So our check-in question today is if you could relive any year of your life, what would it be and why? Whether it was a great year or just because you wanted to redo some things. I'm going to start with Frank Pathyil. He is the Director of Strategy and Partnerships for Workgrid. Frank, great to have you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Neil. So my name is Frank Pathyil. I am the Director of Strategies and Partnerships at Workgrid Software out of the Boston area, New Hampshire specifically. Workgrid's it's in the digital productivity ecosystem, but we're a little different. We're not an internet product. We're really excited to be in these conversations because we think we bring something new. In terms of the question, Neil, it's an interesting, I was thinking about this, it had me vexed all weekend. I think it was really probably the first year out of school. I was doing consulting, I was traveling a lot. I don't think you get to kind of do those first travel experiences a second time. So I think that was a great year. Just going places with actual money in my pocket was a novelty.
Yeah, I hear that. Excellent. Well, good. Well, let's meet. The next one is David Heinemeier Hansson. He is the co-founder of Basecamp and Hey. Hi, David.
Hey. Yes, Basecamp and Hey, 2 products for digital collaboration, stuff I've been working on for almost 20 years. And together with those 2 software products, also written on this topic that we have today quite a lot, wrote a book back in 2013 called Remote Office Not Required. So big fan of this way of working. It's the way I've been working for the past 20 years. And eager to convince others that this is not just a temporary arrangement. This is actually the future, but we'll get into that in a second. In terms of your question, I'd say I like to live life forward. I don't want to go back. I don't want to revisit any year. Every single year I've lived up until this point has shaped who I am. Don't want to change that. I'm more fatty, love your faith. Yeah, no replays.
Excellent. Fantastic. Sounds good. Erica Dhawan is the author of the book Digital Body Language. an authority on digital collaboration. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much. Great to be here with you, David and Frank. As was mentioned, my name is Erica Dhawan. For the last 10 years, I've been a researcher, author, and consultant helping organizations adapt to 21st century collaboration, which we all know is truly digital first. And so if I were going to answer the question, if I would relive one year, it would probably be the year before my first child was born, and doing a lot more traveling and having that free time that I may not be getting back until they're 18 years old.
Excellent. That's definitely a truth. Things change, seasons change throughout as we go. I kind of thinking about Frank's answer too. I was thinking about my own life. Even in a combination like this, last year has been great in a lot of ways. The stage of my family's in, it's just a fun year to be in. But I did spend some time in India, and those first years was really awkward during that time and didn't really embrace all the chances I had while I was there. So one of those two would be there for me too. Well, let's get started with this topic. This came up as I've been working with some companies and doing some consulting with them, realizing that the step from in-office collaboration to digital collaboration seems like for the most people would say like, okay, we're just going to start using Slack and everything's going to be the same. But it really does take a lot of maturity and a lot of sophistication to change those. You have to start thinking about response times. You have to think about what channel you're using. You have to think about the tone that you're doing over digital collaboration. So it does require a lot of skill to be able to do it well. But is this just something that's, as somebody mentioned in a LinkedIn poll that I ran, that collaboration finds a way? We're just going to figure out a way to do there, or do we need to be guided along the way? There's a lot of questions that go through here. So I'm going to invite all of our panelists to give an opening statement, and we're going to start with Erica.
Well, thank you so much, Neil. To kick off my opening statement, I really want to start by setting the stage. In the last 18 months, we've all seen more disruption, yet more innovation in how we work than in perhaps the last 10 years. All of you as leaders have had to reimagine how you connect and collaborate. Digital tools for some of you that got some traction for years are now business requirements, not only for collaboration, but also for social connection, business development, even celebration. And I believe that the question we must ask now is no longer simply how will we adapt to our new normal of digital collaboration, but more importantly, how will we create a better normal of digital collaboration? How will we use the lessons of the last 18 months to make sure we don't revert back to pre-pandemic behaviors? We really ask ourselves, what have we learned more that we want to discard from behaviors in the past? What has changed forever? And more importantly, how do we upskill our teams, our organization to really achieve that maturity? Now, when it comes to being able to achieve that maturity, I like to say that it is possible, but it requires an entirely new way of leaders role modeling these behaviors, of training, of understanding and conviction of what great digital collaboration looks like. I'll never forget pre-pandemic, I was on a conference call. 3 of us were remote and 3 people were in the office. It wasn't until the 26th minute of a 30-minute meeting that someone in the office said, does anyone on the phone have something to share? We had been excluded the entire time. And I think that example really will remind us that the last 18 months have taught us how to be more geographically inclusive, less visually biased to just those in the room. I've heard introverts who have said, I feel like I finally have a voice in our culture. I'm not dealing with extroverts taking up all the airtime in a room. I'm able to chat a message. I'm able to process an idea and then think about it and engage. And so when it comes to true great collaboration today, I like to say that in a digital workplace, body language hasn't disappeared, it has transformed. We now infuse what I call digital body language, which truly makes or breaks whether we will achieve that maturation of great digital collaboration. And I'm not talking about video skills. I'm talking about all the new cues and signals that have replaced traditional body language, from our choice of communication medium, to our response time, to our punctuation, to different ways that we use emotive cues to build a culture of team spirit digitally. So I want to really share 3 things that I think leaders must do in order to really achieve that maturity of great collaboration moving forward. The first thing that I think leaders must do in order to achieve this high performance culture is to define what great collaboration looks like moving forward. That doesn't mean let's have more meetings, let's have more emails, let's have more communication. That's changing our cultures from more communication to smarter, better, and oftentimes less communication. Defining clearly with your team, what does great teamwork look like? What have we learned from the pandemic? How will we measure success around our collaboration? How will we remove proximity bias? I know leaders that have done simple things. They've completely redesigned their cultures. They always have a clear agenda for team meetings that are sent out 48 hours in advance. Then at the beginning of the meeting, everyone shares answers in a chat tool or on a virtual whiteboard, and then they call on people to share. Now, the leaders of these teams have told me they've heard more from their introverts. They're engaging everyone to share in the first 5% of the meeting. And by really designing new ways to refine what work is done asynchronously, to maximize what work is done synchronously, they're speeding up productivity and collective engagement across their workforce. The second key area that I think is incredibly important for leaders to build skills around is to define, what does great inclusion look like in a high-performing digital workplace? I like to say now, valuing visibly is not eye contact and handshakes. It's understanding that valuing others is valuing their time, inboxes, and schedules. Reading messages carefully is the new listening. Writing clearly is the new empathy. We don't walk the talk. We don't talk the talk. We write the talk first. And having clear norms in a way that creates a culture of maniacal clarity. And last but not least, the third key area that I think is more important than ever is to define clear communication norms within your digital workplace. What was implicit in traditional body language must be explicit in digital body language. Let me give you examples of 4 key areas that I think every workplace must have clear playbooks around. The first is team spirit. How do we grow our team culture, our water cooler effect in a digital environment, whether it's radically recognizing others, virtual shout outs, inspiration that you do in a virtual setting. These things matter, and they're often the most missed items from the in-person office. The second is digital communication norms. When we email, when we Slack, when we use these tools, and making sure when we add a new tool, it replaces an existing tool. We're not creating over communication, which erodes collaboration. The third is meeting culture, really defining what a good meeting looks like and killing a lot of the reply all epidemics and the inefficient meeting cultures where 30 people are on, where only 6 people talk. And the fourth area is collaboration tools. Again, we've seen so many more tools, but defining what, when, and how will make or break whether we achieve great collaboration, not just more digital collaboration. So in summary, I think most teams can get there if they focus on defining what great performance looks like, what great inclusion looks like, and what are those communication norms, while also role modeling, creating understanding and conviction, and formal mechanisms so that these aren't nice to haves in a PowerPoint deck, they live and breathe in the digital culture. I'll pause there.
All right, Erica, let me press you a little bit. You're saying it's possible if these things happen,
Yeah.
if they're able to create digital communication norms, if they're able to do things like send out agendas 48 hours in advance, if no one else helps them to do that, in 3 years, will it happen on its own? Just naturally, we'll get better at it, or is that someone has to walk them through that?
You know, I think that at the end of the day, we have to take a thoughtful approach to this, just like moving to a foreign country where we're trying to learn the language. We could try, to learn the new digital language of our culture randomly by listening to people speak, or we could have a defined playbook that will help us learn some of the norms and know that they will adapt over time. And so I would argue that it's critical to have experts that you rely on, but also to understand that this is an agile process. This isn't going to be one dictionary book. Digital culture will be evolving over time. Like there are different regional dialects and accents within a country's culture. And I think the answer is not we're going to just get this and it's going to work. The answer is that we have to build the agility within our culture and the rigorous disciplines that will allow us to improve over time.
All right. Let's pause there. I'm going to turn it over to David to go next in his opening statement.
Sure. So I think the way I like to frame this is that the future has already been here for 20 years, 30 years. People have been working this way remotely, digitally for a very long time. It is only exotic or new for a segment of businesses. And this idea of can we make it or can we not make it, that question to me was answered, if not decades ago, well over 10 years ago, by plenty of companies who've already succeeded doing what everyone is trying to do now. And I think the lesson from doing that and seeing that is that, yes, there are some things to learn and there are some pitfalls, but it's also not rocket surgery. This isn't a completely alien language where you have to learn things from scratch. In fact, many of the key elements of what makes a great remote organization are just elements of what makes a great organization. These things aren't like completely novel, new, foreign things. They are much the same principles as what would make a great organization in any time, in any form of collaboration. I do think, of course, there are some things you should learn, that some things you should dive into, but there aren't that many, in my opinion. If we start with by far the most important, in my experience, it is the transition from synchronous collaboration to asynchronous collaboration, which is mainly something that can be boiled down even further. Stop having all those damn meetings and replace them with writing. Writing is a wonderful way to convey information, to present ideas, to pitch new projects. And that was an idea, a concept that worked just as well, whether we were doing remote or not. But when we are doing remote, it is even more powerful. It allows us not just to be in the same city, in the same country, on the same continent. It allows us to be spread out all over the place in a way where we do not have to line up our calendars, where we do not have to ensure that everyone is at the same virtual place at the same time. At Basecamp today, I am currently sitting in Copenhagen, Denmark, and Jason Fried, my business partner through 20 years, is sitting in Malibu, California. We have a solid 9 hours between us, which on a normal day gives us about 1 or 2 hours of overlap. And it's enough. And it's enough because we write to each other. And then that sync up time, the collaboration that happens and has to happen, can be very little. And I think that that is the grand transition that most companies should make. They should have made that whether we went remote or we didn't go remote. But now that we are remote is the most critical one to make. And then we have to sort of dial it back to and say not only have lots of companies made this transition prior to this pandemic we're in right now, an entire generation of people have made this transition 10 years ago, where they were digital first, where they were text first, where they were like, what, you're going to call me on the phone first as a question mark, right? So this idea of will we make it or will we not make it, we've already made the transition. It's about sort of the rest of the dinosaur epoch, whether they're going to make it, and whether they're going to make it or not make it in a high-functioning, perfect way. Does it matter? Does it matter? 10 years from now, most of the workforce will be made up of people who have known no other way. So I think the future is already here. It's already been here. It just hasn't been as widely distributed as we would like to have seen it. So I'll just pause it there.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. And let's hear from Frank. Frank, what's your opening statement on this?
It's rough going after two thought leaders when you just come back to me. I'm going to largely agree and possibly disagree with both of them. So let's start on with how you define a team, because that was the premise of the question. And you know, like Neil said, like everybody has been sort of saying, this has been proven over 20 years. I myself remember using Basecamp in the 2001, 2002 framework, and then working at Jive Software for a number of years. You're absolutely right. Asynchronous communication is critical. If we were to define teams as 5, 6, 7 people, a marketing department, an HR team, a development team, they are already going to figure this out. And what we have learned in this current moment is that they already are. They are deciding that, hey, we've got a Slack channel or a Teams channel, or we're using WhatsApp, which has happened. We're all going to make sure that we check in on Monday mornings or Friday afternoons or Wednesday at lunch and we're going to have coffee. So they've created their own moments of serendipity, and they've created ways of acting and meeting both, of working together asynchronously that works for them. They are responsive to each other. So this goes to Erica's point about culture, and they are responsible to each other, which goes to the point of being, they've built a good culture amongst themselves. So if we define a team as that, this will work. And I know this. I mean, I've seen this in my own personal life. My mother, who doesn't have an email address, has figured out WhatsApp and how to stay in touch with friends of hers that she can't be in touch with. So I know that barrier can be overcome, and it's already there. The questions when we start to take team and go into the plurality of a larger company. So the marketing department, the HR department, the sales team, the development team, the shipping team. When you start to get to those separations between white collar employees who are often very virtual and blue collar teams that have to be in person, this is where the friction starts to kick in. What if the tool of one team, I was talking to a friend of mine who runs HR, and their CEO has kind of largely embraced Teams because he likes it. He said, you know what, this works for me. But he's using it primarily like a phone, just it's on a computer with a visual element of it. So he has absolutely not made any use of the chat elements and the asynchronous elements. And consequently, he is now creating meeting overload on people because he still needs this to be in person. This is part of this is part of the cultural and generational problem that exists there. Why this matters is in this moment of time is that we've seen a large acceleration, and Erica made a very astute point. This harkens back to Marshall McLuhan, the idea of the medium as the message. How you communicate does matter, and there are hot channels, visual, like this, cool channels, text, written, and then long text like blog posts, which is sort of statements and then quick questions. But they have to be used astutely, and I'm not sure if that's taking place. And I think this is the big challenge of the moment, which is playbooks are matter, but technology is being rolled out faster than playbooks are adapting. And I dare say the cultural decisions are lagging behind the decision to roll out Slack or the decision to roll out Teams. The decision to update one team updating an intranet to somebody else standing up a portal that might be in direct opposition. This technology friction is going to be the constant norm here. And the reality is that as technology vendors, we're incented to keep you in our platform and sort of undermine the larger team goals because the marketing team wants to stay in Asana. The development team wants to stay in Jira. The sales team is trying to say inside Salesforce, IT has rolled out Teams because nobody gets fired for choosing the Microsoft option. And then there's other people who are out there and say, you know what, let's just use Google Hangouts. That friction layer is the barrier right now. This is why in the end I land on this is going to be the main difficulty, and it's a vendor war. Really, the maturity that that has to be brought to bear is us as technology vendors realizing that some things are going to be done on other systems. And not only should we tolerate that, we should actually support that. That is when maturity gets there. Now, the question is whether us as vendors can get to the point that we are willing to cede some ground. I'm unsure about that actually taking place.
Excellent. And we will get into that discussion for sure in a bit. Let me turn it over to Erica again. Erica, is there anything you want to respond from some of the other panelists?
I think that there's one thing that came up that can also set the groundwork of this divide that we often see within workplaces. And that's, I think, primarily because there are different digital styles of those across our workforce. On one end, I believe that there are digital natives that are really thriving, similar to David and Frank. They've been doing this for years. They are virtual first, async first communicators who hate quick phone calls out of the blue, never listen to voicemails, have consistent norms around which channels to use and when. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are those I call digital adapters. they feel more like immigrants to a new country. They have more inconsistent use. They prefer that quick phone call or that 30 people are on that video call, and where they may not even use the chat, but they feel like everyone needs to be there and they need to look everyone in the eye. And I think that what is critical now is to make sure we don't just lose all of our digital adapters. We take this time to really help them. Digital natives need to be patient, need to help create explicit norms, and also to understand what are the areas, places, and spaces where synchronous is better, because it's usually not. Many organizations may struggle. I'm talking manufacturing. I'm talking financial services on the trading floor. They can't be 80% async. They tended to be pre-pandemic 80% synchronous. And so I think it's more about the loop of what is best done asynchronously that maximizes the in-office or the face-to-face or the synchronous time just as much as what is and what isn't asynchronous or synchronous. So I think the more that we can understand these differences and create proactive ways of adapting to those workplace and workforce differences, the more effectively and quickly we'll move to maturity.
Yeah. I think, Erica, you probably represent a little bit more of the mainstream work culture, I would say, if you put David kind of on the front end of what Basecamp's been doing over the last 20 years, and Frank also trying to put those in. So your feeling is like, yes, we can see that this works, it's out there, but it doesn't work exactly the same for everyone.
You know, I think it works, it's out there, but I really want to highlight what Frank shared, which is the fact that there are a lot of technology platforms, which are amazing and that have provided us ways to speed up productivity and engagement. However, what is also happening is many leaders, especially in the last 18 months, have had a knee-jerk reaction to bringing in a new technology vendor without first clarifying what are the behaviors we want to see, what are the norms that we want to ensure we live and breathe within these technologies, and how will we stay accountable? And then what happens is we end up adding a new tool like Slack, but then there are certain teams that are still emailing the same 10 things as well, because digital adapters don't feel comfortable that Slack is a real thing, or a tool that is added has lack of clarity for one team, but is being used by another team. So there's a lot of wasted time. And so I think true collaboration today is not only understanding what different departments are working on, but what are their collaboration norms? What are the tools we use to best communicate with them? And based on different factors, complexity, urgency, familiarity. And once we've laid those out, we can become better at this. The last thing I want to mention is I think there's another factor here, which is trust and power dynamics. There are certain cases and places where a new hire will struggle much more if 80% is async. And so also knowing at the different career journeys, how to best intervene with teams is critical.
Neil, can I jump in?
I know Frank's been itching to jump in. Yeah, go ahead, Frank.
No, look, I think I agree with everything Erica said. I don't know if these things would have been, I mean, look, we were thrust into a global pandemic suddenly, and everybody had to roll everything out. So I think this wasn't necessarily a knee-jerk reaction in the sense that, look, expediency. The question is, in my mind, is did everybody do the work afterwards? I think honestly, part of the problem is the answer is no. And this goes to the question of, do you create great culture if you don't put the work in? Again, I think the answer is no there. I would wonder, and as I was kind of working through my answer, I wondered in the end if this comes down to first level managers and stuff like that. Because the fact of the matter is that if this behavior, everything that we have all said, is ignored, or the bad aspects of it are magnified by the person who manages the employee, whoever the employee, and most of us have a boss, then none of this paradigm is going to work for us. All of these cultural things that we're talking about, all these abilities to adapt, this commitment to fewer meetings, this ability to model and work asynchronously, responsively, and stuff like that, has to be mirrored by the person that is managing me. Otherwise, this will fall apart. And I think if we were going to go look and press at a particular point, it really starts to focus on managers and making it easy for managers to work asynchronously, making it very easy for them to be aware of the moments that they have to work with somebody and, back off a little bit, and then starting to understand generations, distances, and stuff like that. And I think this is that big point. This is that moment that we really need great managers to be smart and develop skills that are maybe quote unquote softer skills that will allow for digital collaboration to take place. And that in turn is what's going to build great cultures.
Yeah, let me turn it over to David for a second. And specifically, David, I know that you are in the midst of, your company, you've intentionally kind of kept it about the same size for a long time and been able to establish some great norms throughout that time. And you've recently talked about that you're going to be growing, doubling or more in your employee count. Tell us about what you're hearing with all this.
Well, the first thing I'd say is in this entire discussion, we have to make sure, what are we benchmarking against? Are we benchmarking against some idea that everything was awesome when companies were not running remotely, that companies were by and large well-functioning organizations where everyone got what they wanted and were making progress? No, we weren't. Most companies are complete messes in sort of the most endearing sense of that term, right? So the contrast here is, can we come up with this utopian vision for the perfect remote organization? Because that was not the baseline. The baseline was, this was already a hobbled together mess. And I think we need to be realistic in our expectations when we look across all organizations. Will the future magically be better just because we're remote? No, it won't. Most companies will continue to be a hobbled mess of managers who are untrained or unwilling or whatever. All the standard blockers for organizational progress will still be in place. So when we talk about the maturity of digital collaboration, we have to talk about, well, what was the maturity of in-person collaboration? By and large, pretty low, right? You have to factor in all these aspects of the culture we're living in, that a third at least of particularly white-collar workers think they perform bullshit jobs that have no purpose and advance the world in no meaningful way. So that's not to be a pessimist about it, just be realistic about it, because if we have the utopian goal in mind and then we contrast our progress towards that and go oh, we aren't there yet, we're inevitably going to be disappointed. And then we might render the wrong verdict here, is that remote can't work because we don't get to utopia. No, that's not the bar. We just have to be marginally better than where we were, which is not necessarily a huge jump.
Excellent. So you would say that in terms of rephrasing this question, most teams will be roughly equivalent as they were pre-digital to moving towards digital, remote, asynchronous, perhaps a little bit better, or just basically the same as it was?
Well, I think there's sort of the promise that things could be better, but I'm more realistic than that. I think most organizations will continue to model through, and most workers will continue to have the experience that they had before we went remote, that they're frustrated about their boss, they're annoyed at the coworkers, they have all the human friction that was present before, and it'll be present still. So as long as we keep that in mind, we can look at these small wins and go all right, we made a few things a little better. We got 2% better here, we got 3% better here. Not expecting this huge transformation is going to happen in organizations across the board, because that's unlikely.
So the bar is low.
Yes, exactly. And in some ways, that's a relief. When the bar is so low, then our interventions just have to be marginally better than where we were before, and we've made progress.
I mean, I would say that actually in many of the more traditional industries, not high tech, where a lot of work was already done asynchronously, I would say they are struggling more as a result of the digital workplace. It's not, equal to pre-pandemic, it's worse. And the data shows that 75% of traditional face-to-face collaboration is our nonverbal body language. And now if you really remove that and 100% is virtual, I think that those are workforces of digital adapters that are struggling in much higher way than they were maybe 20 months ago. They did have bad meetings. They did have bad email exchanges, but the rate and pace of it is much worse now.
Those companies are going to get caught, though. I mean,
well, the Great Resignation. I mean,
yeah.
I think that it's a culmination point of something that's existed for 10 years, but this was a trigger moment 18 months into this.
Is the question then how? I think I accept everything both everybody has said. Is the question really to ask how to make it better, or how to avert the problem you're about to run into right now with the Great Resignation? That's going to, I'll give you an example. I was talking to somebody over the weekend. They work 10 minutes that way. On November 1st, they're expecting to all be back in the office. They've figured out how to work remotely. They're going to hang out till Christmas, and they're gone by January. And that is a Fortune 500 company's marketing department is going to empty out in the next 8 weeks. And it's all because their CEO decided we're back in the office because we're a in-person culture, and a whole lot of, I'm not a CEO, so I can't use David's word, but I will say a whole bunch of BS. Is the question really how to avert that? Because I do think this, in the end, where the rubber meets the road, is that if you get this wrong, you are going to lose people. And that is really what this boils down to. There's a lot of high-minded talk about how to be better cultures. Pragmatically, as for leaders, the real question is, if you don't get this right, are you going to be able to run a business, because people are going to be exiting?
Well, I think that might be one of those blessings in disguise, that out of great crisis comes something else, right? And we've been blessed with this great crisis in certain ways, and it is an opportunity for new things to be configured in a different way. And maybe some companies, existing companies, struggling with this is exactly what we need to upend certain businesses, certain industries, certain markets, and allow for new entrants and new ideas to win out. So I think actually sort of infusing some of this difficulty is part of what makes the world interesting, and why we shouldn't necessarily look at it like, oh, is this a bad thing? Well, there could also be some good things coming out of it, that a whole marketing department leaves and decides they're going to start their own company, or they're going to do things differently in certain ways. I think this is the great benefits of these shocks, that instead of ossifying around a certain way of working, now we get to look at things in a new way.
Yeah. I would say, David, even when you mentioned yourself and Jason working 9 hours apart, I think that's also a good example of how you respond to that challenge. Time zones, when you only have an hour or 2 hours to get together, you sit there with two options. One is that you make it work. You figure out how to do great work with only that amount of synchronous time. Or you say, screw it, you have to come live here and come to the office every day, because that's the way we're going to do it. And I think that's the decision where a lot of companies are trying to make. Are we going to say, hey, this is an opportunity, we can make this work? Or are they going to say, let's get back to what we know how to do?
But this is the awesome thing, as Frank says, they don't actually get that choice. It's not like you can choose the one thing. In Frank's example, they chose, we're all getting back to the office. That wasn't a real choice, because the people they were working with decided, yeah, I'm not going back to the office. And I'd be the same way. I'd be out the door too if Jason came to me and said, like, hey, dude, we're going back to the office now. After 20 years, I'd be like, well, good luck with that.
Very good. Well, I do want to open it up to some Q&A. If anyone has some questions to throw in there, that would be great. I will start with my first one. Frank, you alluded to this a little bit, but do you all feel like, especially as teams grow and go beyond, you're seeing this new position pop up in some more high-tech companies called head of remote, or someone head of digital or something like that, who's more like a, let's say, a collaboration czar who sits over and says, this is how we're going to do things. We're going to make policies for everything. We're going to kind of set the standards, set the working agreements. That's one option to counteract, figure out how to make some best practices. And the other one is just to say, everyone figure out how to do it on your own teams. Pluses and minuses to both sides. Erica, let's start with you. What do you think about that?
I am not a fan of one collaboration czar. I don't think that this is a separate division in an organization. I think it is. It requires each and every one of us. But I think that there are three things that businesses need to do right now. The first thing is to set what are their collaboration agreements, whatever that is, around what great performance looks like, what those communication norms are, so that it's clear. Because I think for much of us, there's no guide around how to make better decisions, when to use different tools, and why. The second is to make sure that there is a clear definition of best practice norms in those 4 areas I mentioned earlier: meeting culture, digital communication, team spirit, those water cooler moments, and collaboration tools. And then the third is to actually have champions on the front line sitting in each silo that are keeping their eyes and ears on the ground to ensure that teams are role modeling these behaviors, norm keeping, addressing when, or having a polite correction method when people aren't adhering to these norms. And I think that's what a great culture looks like. And I would say that that's what's critical. Every leader of every team needs to own defining those norms, but the organization should have some clear collaboration rules of the road. Again, I don't think it can be done by one person. It has to then be owned by champions. So those are some of my thoughts.
Cool. David, what about you?
Yeah, I think it's particularly interesting for us since in April of this year, we had a huge blow up at our company because that etiquette wasn't actually clearly defined and things drifted over time. Like, for example, is it acceptable to use these tools for political activism? Should that be a part of our day-to-day work? Is that something we do next to our to-do lists? And I think what was interesting about that was that we had that challenge, given the fact that we'd still worked remotely for 20 years. And that was something that kind of popped up in 18 months or so, went from like a seedling to a full-on burning bush. And I think that was a sort of just a good reminder of like, there's just also so much you can prepare for, in the sense of you don't get to live in a vacuum. You also get to be plopped right down into a specific cultural situation. The US in particular is in a really funky / weird / screwed up place right now. That there's only so much you can kind of do on your own. You can try to build some bulwarks against that, but also just accepting like that's just the place and time we may find ourselves in, and then reacting to that.
Good. I'm going to come back to something you said too, David, but Frank, first let me hear from you. Collaborations are or distributed at all?
You know, it's interesting. I think I do fall towards a czar, but I don't like the topic. I don't like the title czar. I prefer the title of coach, probably. You know, even Gartner is starting to cite the idea of some sort of digital owner. And they've got a profile of a person who's got a change management background, like a big Josh Bersin fan, supposedly. No direct reports, but sits in HR, but with alignment to organizational change, to learning, and to IT to kind of guide that. And I saw that in action. It was funny. I remember listening to a podcast about the you know, David's situation, and it's not new. When I was at Jive, we had this we had an interesting culture. We had a lot of city people. We had a lot of rural developers from Oregon, and every time there was a shooting, we would have this big, what we would call brew pile, where you would have the city people screaming about guns and the rural people who are a lot of the development team not into the whole idea of limiting guns, and this would tend to build up. And what tended to take place, and it's not that we had a czar or coach in place, we just had a lot of people with this sensibility, was that we would pull back and recenter and de-escalate. We'd build some moments of serendipity sometimes, so that, you know, one side would run into the other side and realize that they don't necessarily hate each other over a topic which has nothing to do with work, and that they can work together. I think this is where it fits. It's sort of a middle ground. I don't know if it's necessarily an owner, but I think there's got to be somebody who feels a mandate to build this in the company and take this message. So maybe it's a bit of an apostle or an evangelist internally who has this sensibility. I do think that's needed, because I think the generational barrier will dictate that we can't just sort of learn this on our own, but it is good behavior to have. I think it's worth leaders investing in this individual and giving them a mandate and telling them go forth and spread the word.
Yeah. Let me come back, like I said, to David's issue you brought up. Obviously, it was in the news in April. We're 6 months or so removed from it. Do you feel like the nature of digital remote encourages people just to have a little bit more keyboard courage, a little bit more of willingness to jump in and say what they would have said, but they wouldn't have said it had they been in person? Do you feel like that's just kind of a liability that's there and a tension to manage among digital teams? Or is there a way that you feel like it could have been handled differently or established better norms?
I definitely think that is a factor when you're at work and half the time you're perhaps on Twitter or Facebook or any other social media that has a certain tone. It's very easy for that to bleed into the next text box you're putting in words to, and separating those two things and having some etiquette about what's appropriate behavior, language, topics at work is a big challenge. But of course, as we found, our brouhaha was focused around exactly that, setting those etiquettes. So while I think that is crucially important, you also just realize that at some point you're not going to get, or you might run the risk that you're not going to get unscathed through that process, right? That the process itself of saying what is reasonable topics for us to discuss together at work is a highly contentious discussion, particularly in the United States, and less so elsewhere around the world. And that's just something you got to deal with, which is also, I think, why Frank's point about, like, is this a coach? Like, how do we set these norms? Some of this, I think, has to come with the authority of whoever runs the company, whether that's at a VP level or executive level or CEO, that is where that authority of, like, hey, this is how we're going to do it, needs to come. That doesn't mean it'll be peacefully accepted. It certainly wasn't in our case. But you couldn't delegate that, right? Like, the higher the stakes, the higher the emotion, the more important it is that challenge is met by authority that can push through it. Because if you take our example and you imagine it happening at some other company where the collaboration czar or coach was the one putting this out, right? As we've seen time and again, what would have happened? That person would have gotten fired and no one would have been interested in touching that with a 10-foot pole ever again. So I think that is where some of this is. And some of it hopefully is also just like we have these spikes of mania in our culture that reaches certain tenet points that are really loud. And then a year, 6 months, 2 years later, it's a completely different situation. And you look back and go like, oh, wow, remember that? That was something. And for our organization, for example, 6 months has provided that. We're in the thick of our situation in April. You think, oh man, the world is ending. What's going to happen? And then you look six months later, you go like, do you know what? That was really difficult, but it was also really healthy. And that is some of the crucial point, as I made with Frank before, that some of this crises is like, this is a process you should welcome to some extent. It's difficult in the moment, but on the other side of the crisis is clarification. Right? Absent of the crisis, we sort of just go with these things under the surface, and at some point they keep sort of bubbling up. You have a good, solid crisis, and you might move on to a completely new place that is free of all of that. Difficult, painful to get there, but wow, the flowers smell much better on the other side.
I think
it's just
David,
hard to sign up for a crisis.
Yeah, David, you're bringing up something that I think is important also, which is as leaders continue to adapt, they also have to check their biases. And I want to share a story here. I know an SVP at a gaming company, he had 2 direct reports, and he's very much a digital adapter. He likes clear, good writing with good punctuation and bullet points, bold and underlined headings. And he has one direct report, Allie, who has a Slack channel with her team. And it's very clear. Everything has good project notes, clear analysis, those bold headings. And then his other direct report, his Slack channel, Dave's Slack channel, includes emojis, memes, GIFs, and At first, Brad, the leader, had no idea what Dave's team was doing. At first, he was nervous. Are they doing any work? Compared to Ali's team, where he had a clear understanding of what was going on. But then he realized, within a month, that the quality of their work outputs were the same. And if he were going to force Dave to be more like Ali, he would actually be losing that team's authenticity and style. So obviously, we have to be professional, but this also involves leaders getting comfortable being uncomfortable and checking their bias. I know another leader of a global team. She has colleagues in Buenos Aires, London, and Sydney, Australia, and she's in New York. She found her colleague in Buenos Aires wasn't engaging on video calls. At first, she thought he was multitasking or maybe not interested. Finally, she said, I should stop assuming, and she asked him, and he wrote back in an IM, I'm having such a hard time translating 3 different English accents when English is not my native language, American, British, Australian, at the same time. So she started using closed captioning. She slowed down. She used virtual whiteboards more. And it made a big difference, not just for him, but for really everyone on the team. And so, I think, again, this moment is about defining those norms, but in the moment, every leader being comfortable, being uncomfortable, and not assuming everything's okay, but having regular rituals and check-ins.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm going to go to a Q&A question here. I'm going to combine a couple, actually, really talking about the cultural element. We've spoken a little bit. We don't want to keep this conversation US-centric, and I know most of you have some experience around the world in different places. So do you feel like it's possible to arrive at, a multi-world, multicultural example? Octolia has asked the question, how do you arrive at etiquette in a cross-cultural environment? Abhishek has said, do you see significantly different needs and adoption levels in Southeast Asian countries like India? There's lots of different values, lots of different societies. In all your experiences, what do you say there? Erica, let's start with you.
Again, similar to what we talked about earlier, cross-culturally, there are just added issues, but also added benefits of our digital workplace. We could be more globally inclusive. We can use factors, like I mentioned, of closed captioning, virtual whiteboarding tools. I would argue that for the modern day global distributed team, number one, don't be afraid to discuss differences. What may work for an India team may not always be working best for the US team, and having those clear conversations really matter. Secondly, really aligning on what work can be best done async versus sync. And even when you need to do synchronous work, being thoughtful about time zones, rotating meeting hosts, knowing nuances. In the US, if you ask someone to do something, they may say yes on a call and they'll do it. In Japan, a cultural norm, if you ask someone to do something on a video call, they may say yes, but yes may mean I acknowledge your request in order to save face, but you need to have that one-on-one call. So even having some cultural code within your organization can be effective here. And then lastly, making sure that you're not measuring success in airtime or how often you see others, whether in their inbox or face-to-face, and making sure that you're being thoughtful about driving that global inclusion, especially those that are in non-headquarters locations. So those are just some thoughts related to global inclusion.
Yeah. Frank, what about you?
It's funny. So I have Indian parents, and I've been using Zoom on them. And I remember being on a work call with somebody, and they said, well, this consulting company we're working with in India said yes. And I said, did they say yes? And they said, he said yes. He shook his head. I go, did he shake it like this, or did you get the figure 8? Because the figure 8 is what my mom says when she wants me to just stop talking and not listen to me. And there are things like that. And I think this is the exciting part about, there's the concepts of global citizens and people who are hyper local. And if you look at kind of the global cultural divide that's going on right now, it's the anywheres versus the somewheres, the people who are very much from places and anchored in their traditions against people who are global. And I think this norm of the global team really demands that you have people who can function anywhere, because you do have to be astute to those triggers, the Japanese cultural norms. My father on a Zoom call, he does not, you might have noticed, I'm an interrupter. My father does not tolerate interruptions at all, and this is a patriarchal thing. I've been on calls with some Europeans, and interruptions are kind of it's just how we talk. So those cues are the trickiest part, visually, and this I think is going to be kind of the interesting going forward question is, how do we create something that is global? I wonder if we will wind up at kind of a universal meeting culture in 5 or 10 years, because we have so many of these Zoom meetings, and we will all become a little, and maybe everybody in the world will learn the figure eight eventually. I don't know.
David, what about you? How broad is your team? Have you been able to adapt to different cultures?
Yeah, we have people in, I don't know, 7, 8 different countries, have been distributed not just within a single country, but from the very start across continents and cultures. And I agree, there's a bunch of tactical things that you have to be aware of. But I think, again, we also have to remember and be conscious of, like, what is a reasonable expectation? Is it such that we will all develop appreciation for all sorts of different cultural norms and cues and level up? I think some will, certainly, and they will probably be very valuable in the organization for it. But is that something that's going to happen to every employee working everywhere? And probably not. And I think some of the perhaps simpler ways to deal with some of these issues is to set some forms of boundaries of, hey, Frank's example, should we talk about school shootings as part of the way that we bond as a team? Perhaps there's a way for that to work at a sub-team level across an entire organization. I'd like to see that organization that can manage that. I've not seen it yet. I've seen plenty of examples to the contrary. Exactly, right? So those are some of the boundaries that I think companies also have to be more explicit about. Like, what are the things that we will choose to consider reasonable topics of discussions, and how we engage with each other. The other factor that comes in there is, as we talked about, the different software products you can use. I think actually this idea that we'd be better off if we were all connected on a single platform and everyone could reach everyone is a complete misnomer. Slack in particular has been actually a bit of a poison pill for a lot of organizations, as they've realized that groups that have thousands of people in them very quickly devolve into something that's not only not productive, but actively harmful when you have 2,000 people trying to discuss, for example, I don't know, remote benefits, or how do you set that up? It takes just 1% of the people in that room, 20 people, to decide, no, actually it should be exactly this thing. And you go like, oh, it looks like everyone agrees. No, they don't. There's a 1%, 20 people discussing this right now with furious energy. And that creates the appearance that we're all in alignment, and we're totally not. So I think the other aspect of adopting all this technology is to think about, when should we not adopt it? Who should we not connect? How large can our groups reasonably be? Can you have 2,000 people in a chat room and get anything good out of that in the long run? I'm quite pessimistic on that front. And I think the over-connecting of the organization is a serious risk factor for a lot of particularly bigger, older organizations. You see it at Apple, you see it at other organizations. You're like, you know what? They are not better off from being at the forefront of adopting these kinds of collaboration tools and using them in these kinds of ways.
Yeah, very important point, and one you don't typically hear. And usually we see it, we have to be more connected. We have to have, break down all these communication silos and things, but there are a lot of negative parts of that too. We are reaching the end of our time, so I want to thank you all very much for being here. Shweta, if you can run our poll real quick one more time to see if anyone changed their mind on this. I feel like the topic we have delved into, there's obviously lots more things we could talk about, but I really appreciate each of you. David, Erica, Frank, you guys brought a lot of wisdom, nuance, exposure, wisdom to this topic, and there's just a lot of things that I'm walking away with. I hope all of our guests are here as well. I want to give a big thank you to our sponsors, to Kissflow, and to Workgrid, and to Robin. So please check those out in some of our posts and the follow-up that will be there as well. Thank you all for attending. This is the first of our debates. We have another one coming up at 2 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking about digital leadership. Specifically, our topic is leaders of earlier generations are unequipped to excel in the digital age. So maybe even a follow-up from this conversation there as well. We welcome you all back to that. Thank you all again, and it's been great. And we'll see the rest of you back in a couple hours.
Thank you.